Good morning, Olive Branch family, and welcome to our online service. Merry Christmas. My name is Jeremiah, and we're so excited that you're able to join us on our online service. Before we go on to the service today, we want to remind you that on Saturday, December 24th, we have a Christmas Eve service at 5 p.m. and 7 p.m., and you don't want to miss out on that opportunity to praise God and to celebrate His birth this Christmas Eve, so you don't want to miss out on that. But before we go into that, we do have a service today. Pastor Ken's going to continue on his new series, The Story. You don't want to miss out, but before we go on to that, our worship team is ready to lead us in worship. So let's give God praise and adoration and have an amazing Sunday.
Let earth receive great to see you. It's great to be able to sing Christmas songs again, isn't it? And it's not that far away, just about another week, and we're going to be right on top of Christmas again. That's good. That's good. We've been talking about the story, which is the most probably unbelievable story in history, and yet it's the best known story, and it's the story of Christmas. This year, North America will spend about $1 trillion celebrating Christmas. So people know this story, and in some cases, it's a story of extravagance. For some, it brings some pain to it. But it's an unbelievable story. There's stuff in it that you think, I don't know if that could have happened. It's disturbing, and we're going to talk about that today. And it would appear that it changed nothing, at least at the time. It changed nothing. And the question that has been asked, and the question we talked about last week is it actually true? It's a pretty good question, right? Whenever we look at a story, there's always a storyline, just about every, story, including this one. Things are going well, and then stuff happens, and so then we try to fix the stuff that happens, and then it gets worse, and hit bottoms out, and then a hero comes, and it gets better. And so the question is, who's the hero? Who's the hero in this story? In this story, of course, it's Jesus, but he split history, and it's so unbelievable to think that because he's this baby in a manger, and yet, this big crack appears before he came and then after he came. And it's also the same with our story because his story intersects my story and intersects your story as well. Now, we all have a story, okay? Most of us write our stories. We all write our stories, in fact, one chapter, one decision at a time. And we all have the chapters where there's the glory moment, and we'd show it off. This is my wife. Isn't she gorgeous? I married her back in 1977. She is drop dead gorgeous, And then there's this little book I wrote, that's a chapter, and these are all my degrees, seminary degrees and doctorate and ordination and so on. So we all have these chapters that we would like to celebrate. We'd love to show them to other people and maybe even brag about them a little bit, okay? But they're also the chapters in our lives that we would like to forget. We'd hide them if we could. We'd shove them under the carpet. We'd burn the pages to them, It's the chapter where the title of the chapter could be, What Was I Thinking? Why would I ever do something so stupid? It's the chapter where we inflicted pain on ourselves. It's somebody warned us about it, and we just went and did it anyways. And we just went through this painful, awful, awful time. It's the weekend that we would like to forget. We all have those chapters in our story. Christmas story is a powerful and comforting story about how God intervened in human history to make all things right, how he entered into this mess we call history to change it. And it's good news of great joy. And best of all, it's true. But there is another side to the story. There are villains in this story. There are really disturbing parts of this story. We're going to be talking about some of them today. Our story is about an actual earthly villain that actually tried to kill Jesus off before he could even come. And there's also a story of what this looked like from a heavenly perspective, which is a very disturbing perspective. It's more like the invasion of Normandy than it is of a love story between Mary and Joseph and Jesus. So let me just put it out there, okay? If you've ever wondered why it's so hard to do what is right, to say yes to what we want and no to what we don't want, well, this story tells us why. If you've ever wondered why there's this selfish, cold, hard part of us, and that, generosity just about sends us into spasms, this explains why. If you've ever wondered, why these days, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called goblin mode, where you just want to sit in bed and languish, and eat potato chips, and get up in your jammies and go out and get the mail and so on. If you've ever wondered why it's so easy to stay in that mode, this chapter explains why. In the early morning hours of 6 BC, there was a faint cry heard, and the strangest thing is it was coming from a stable. And it was mixed in with all the other animal noises and noises of maybe traffic starting up or whatever was going on in Bethlehem at that time. But it was actually the sound of history cracking into two big pieces. And that cry was the beachhead. It changed everything. It's beautiful and it's comforting, but it's disturbing. So buckle in to your seats, and I'm going to basically tell you some of the behind-the-scenes stories going on in this account. The first one is actually quite scary. It's found in the book of Revelations and so on, and which book of Revelations is pretty much disturbing at every level, okay? But John records this. He writes it down. He's on the Isle of Patmos, and he's been banished from society because he's a believer in Jesus. Listen to what he writes. Then I witnessed in heaven an event of great significance. I saw a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon beneath her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant, and she cried out because of her labor pains and the agony of giving birth. And then I witnessed in heaven another significant event. I saw a large red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns with 7 crowns on his heads. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars in the sky, and he threw them to the earth. And he stood in front of the woman as she was about to give birth, ready to devour her baby as soon as it was born. She gave birth to a son who was to rule all the nations with an iron rod. And her child was snatched away from the dragon and was caught up to God and to his throne. Now, can you imagine a Christmas pageant on this stage put on by Miss Ann, where you've got, Mary and Joseph and the baby in the manger and miscellaneous shepherds and animals and so on, spread around. And then this monstrous dragon appears from over here, ready to consume everybody that's on the stage. I mean, this would kind of make Jurassic Park look like Toy Story. Now, this is all apocalyptic language to basically describe what spiritual reality was. There wasn't an actual dragon with 10 heads and 7 crowns and all this stuff on it. This is talking about how Satan kind of incarnated himself in Rome. An actual reality was that Satan was behind it, and the point was to destroy the baby and destroy Jesus. The woman in this story, well, it's not Mary, okay? It says that she has the moon beneath her feet and the sun around her, and then the 12 stars, and that gives you some idea who this is. This is the nation of Israel. And again, John is using apocalyptic language to describe in these weird, strange terms, visionary terms, the reality of what was really going on. Now, without going into a lot of detail and so on, and I could, but I don't want to, this is basically depicting a stunning rebellion that's going on in the spiritual realm. Now, Jesus talked about it, and he said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. That's his reference to it. We find Paul talking about it in Ephesians chapter 6, and he says that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers of darkness in high places. Jesus basically made it clear that he had come to destroy what Satan was trying to do, which is rebel and bring everything down that God loved, and so on. And I'll tell you, this makes sense of why evil has such a grip on our planet. Now, it goes on to say, there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and his angels, and the dragon lost the battle, and he and his angels were forced out of heaven. This great dragon, the ancient serpent, called the devil or Satan, the one deceiving the whole world, was thrown down to the earth with all of his angels. Now, does it make sense to you why life is sometimes really, really difficult? It's because there is an unseen force at work in this world. Now, this is the only scenario that makes sense of another really disturbing story, a part of the Christmas story that we know. Matthew tells us in his account, he starts out with basically some very disturbing stories about Jesus' ancestry, and he goes into some of the details there, and pretty graphic and so on in terms of what went on back with his ancestors. But he tells us that there were magi that came. They were wise men. They were royal astrologers that came from the east. Now, it's very likely that they came from Babylon. Daniel was the head magi or head, royal astrologer, if you want to call it that, then. And we're guessing that they probably were influenced by him. So they come into Jerusalem. They've made this long trip. It's like 1,500 kilometers. And they start going around the city asking, so where's the King of the Jews at? And we saw his star in the east. He's been born. We've come to worship him. This was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. This is to understand Herod, who was the reigning king. You have to understand that he had spent his entire life making sure that he got the title King of the Jews and protecting it. And he killed his own kids, he killed one of his wives, and he killed anybody who got in the way. That was his deal, okay? So to do this was basically asking for trouble. So this is what it says. Then Herod called for a private meeting. He says he's really disturbed, called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star had first appeared. And then he told them, go to Bethlehem, search carefully for the child, and then when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him. The guy's a snake, okay? After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. So this Bethlehem is only about 7 miles away, about 10 kilometers. And it went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house, and they saw the child with his mother Mary. So understand, they're not living, this isn't at the manger, okay? They're in a house, and at this point, Jesus is a child, probably a toddler. And they bowed down and worshiped him. This is amazing. Then they opened their treasure chest and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And when it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. Now, these are the first people to actually worship Jesus as the Son of God and to give him gifts and so on. It wasn't, like they got a birth announcement. They saw a star. And then they had to figure out what was going on. They made like a 4-month trip, probably by caravan. It wasn't just 3 of them, probably more like 100 of them, or somewhere around that number. And then they had to make the 4-month trip back. So this was a very difficult and expensive journey. And of course, Herod, being the snake that he was, he flies into a rage because somebody is contesting his authority. Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are dead. This is, again, you never see this on a Christmas card. You never see this in a Christmas pageant, played by little kids. It's called the Massacre of the Innocents. That's what it's been called down through history. And here's what I know. Some of you, I've been talking about Satan and how he's thrown out of heaven and so on, and just what's been going on. You don't have any space in your minds for this whole stuff about Satan and angels and all this and all. It sounds like it's something out of the Middle Ages, okay? That's probably how it registers. And I just want to say this, okay? First of all, this is not some funny little guy, wearing a red onesie, with horns and hooves and pitchfork and stuff like this. From what we understand, he was created as one of God's most powerful, most beautiful angels. And it was his pride, it was his desire to be God that caused him to have this conflict with God and to end up being thrown out of heaven. So this, I understand if you don't, if this is, you have a struggle with thinking about this or imagining this, but you have to understand that Jesus is the one who gives us the information on this. There's other prophecies that give us some of the details, but Jesus is the one who makes it clear that evil is personified in this person, Satan or the devil. So you kind of have to figure that out because he's the one who came to change everything. But I'm telling you, when you look at this, this is the only thing that makes sense of things like Auschwitz and Pol Pot, and the purge of Mao Zedong, and some of the stuff that's going on today with child trafficking. You try to get your head around that, okay? How do you get your head around that kind of evil? Sense of it. This is probably the only thing that actually makes sense of it. Now, the link between these two stories and so on is something that we all know about. We all know about this, okay? And so I'm just going to kind of go into it and see if you can kind of guess what it is. What is it that keeps you from celebrating when somebody has a success and a win? You want to do it, but it's kind of like, I don't think so, What is it that keeps you and me from admitting that you're wrong? What is it about that? What is it that keeps us from initiating an apology? Even when we know that we're at least partly in the blame. What is it that keeps us from doing that? What is it that causes us to keep arguing our point when increasingly we realize we pretty much don't have a point, but yet we will keep on arguing it? What is it, guys, that keeps us from kind of humbling ourselves and saying, okay, I'm lost. I need some directions. What is it? What is it? What is it that keeps you from owning your weakness and admitting that you probably need some help if you're ever going to get out of the situation that you're in? What is it that keeps you from being honest with yourself and honest with others, that you're addicted to porn, that you're addicted to prescription drugs, that you're addicted to money, you're addicted to alcohol, you're addicted to something? What is it that keeps you from doing that? What is it that keeps you from learning new things because you basically want to kind of make it look like you know it all? You don't need to learn anything new. What is it that causes you to secretly rejoice when other people fall and fail? What is it that causes us to power up instead of, basically, opening up? What is it that causes us to cheat when we know we're going to fail, and so we want to cheat to make sure that we don't fail? What is it? What is it that causes you to lie about your past, to lie about the failed marriage, to lie about, what happened with the job that you loved and you lost? Or the fact that you never graduated from high school? What is it that causes you to need to have the final word? Like you just got to throw the last knife and stick it in the person's back. What is it that causes you to spend money that you can't afford to spend? To buy stuff to impress people who don't even notice and will never notice what's going on? It's pride. It's pride. Just say it with me. It's pride. Just nod your head and say, it's pride. Really ugly in other people, right? Really ugly in other people. Really ugly in other people. But I'll tell you what, it's almost impossible to see it in the mirror. We're victims of it, and then we become victimizers. We victimize other people. It's insidious, and it's at the root of what is rotting our world. Pride. So, let's just kind of be honest about it. Pride is a prison. It causes us to do things that we would like to not admit. It keeps us from the things that we really need to do. And it's a prison. And we get locked in the prison, and then it keeps God and it keeps other people out. We get isolated in this prison of pride. And pride is what drove the devil to defect from God and then try to wreck everything that he'd ever created. And that sometimes gets into us. We think of pride, that kind of makes us bigger than life, and so on. Actually, it diminishes us. It makes us small. It makes us too small to admit what we need to admit. It makes us too small to help, to say what we need to say. It makes us too small to actually apologize. And it keeps us from speaking into other people's lives the words that we need to speak. I would be willing to guarantee there are people in your world who need to hear something from you. They need to hear a compliment from you. They need your affirmation. But you won't say it because you're too proud. Pride is what makes us, makes it impossible for us to sometimes hear the things that we need to hear. There are things that are wrecking our lives and wrecking our relationships and pressing everybody out to the wall, but we just can't hear it because of our pride. And it's so emotional. That's the problem. It's not intellectual because, when you look at it from a logical perspective, it's stupid. But it's so emotional. And it keeps us from doing what we need to do. And here's the deal. God's call in our lives is for us to love God and to give him what he deserves from our lives. And it's the pride that keeps us from doing it. It's the pride that shoves God out. Pride keeps us from loving and keeps us from being loved. See, when you're proud, it's being full of me and too full of me to allow anybody else in there. And sometimes we don't even know it. Sometimes we think everybody else has got the problem. Somebody else is, they're the ones that argue all the time. They're the ones that have to be right. And they're the ones that will never apologize, instead of looking at ourselves and seeing what we need to see. It's a prison. Now, how many of you think that pride in other people is an ugly thing? Just, even if you're home, just kind of raise your hand. It is ugly, isn't it? It's really ugly. And yet, we many times can't see it in the mirror. Now, Herod is the one who basically personifies this and so on. He's called Herod the Great in history, ironically, okay? So let me just this is pride, okay? It's obvious in others, it's not us, and there's blood running off from underneath the door, makes us too small to hear what we really need to hear. But I want to kind of get into Herod, and this may be a little bit confusing, but in case you can't see it, he's got a crown on because he's Herod the Great, but he's pride personified. Now, when you read some of his story, what you find out is that he was a fantastic builder, okay? He built Masada, but he built it for himself, to protect himself. He built the temple in Jerusalem. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world, but he built it to try and get people to support him. He built Caesarea. Guess who that was about? Well, he was indebted to Caesar for giving him the role of king of the Jews. So it all went back to him. He was a murderer. He murdered his favorite wife, Miriam. He murdered 3 of his sons, murdered too many people to basically count. But it all went back to himself. He's protecting his crown. He was a great leader. He really was. That's why he's called Herod the Great. But it all went back to himself. And he was a master negotiator. At one point, he had backed the wrong general in Rome. And then, the guy then became, the other guy became Caesar. And this would be Caesar Augustus and so on. He actually negotiated with the Roman Senate to basically get his job. Pride turned him into a monster. And history bears that out all through. It's really interesting. You go to Israel and you see all the things that Herod built, still around because he's Herod the Great. But he was a monster. Now, it says he called a meeting of the leading priests. There's kind of a latent pride in what goes on there, okay? I just want to focus on that. And teachers of the religious law. And he asked, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? In Bethlehem in Judea, they said, for that's what the prophet wrote. So they can quote chapter and verse. They knew the answer right off. This was no big deal. They knew their Bibles. And you, O Bethlehem in the land of Judah, you are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come out from you who will be the shepherd for my people Israel. So they knew that there was going to be a ruler coming out of Bethlehem. What's interesting is that the Magi make a 4-month trip to go and see this baby, and they won't even travel. They never even check it out. Why? It's pride. It's why would God speak to these spooky guys from Babylon and not tell us? He would surely tell us first because we're the religious professionals. It's pride. And ultimately, they finished what Herod started. 33 years later, they nailed this baby to a cross, had him nailed to a cross and watched him die. God blocked off Herod's plan to kill Jesus because he wanted to accomplish his plan. And of course, he warned them, and if you read on in the story, you find out that Jacob and Mary, or Joseph and Mary and Jesus, escaped to Egypt, and they lived there probably for about 2 years. What sets the Christmas story way apart from every other story is the introduction of true humility into the story. See, humility, and we're going to be talking more about this on Christmas. See, humility had never been a virtue before. It had always been a fault. And all of a sudden, God steps out of heaven. He starts with a teenage girl, and he knows that this is going to ruin her reputation, and she knows that too. She's going to be called all the names that they call girls who get pregnant out of wedlock and sleep with all the guys, okay? And yet she says, I am the Lord's servant. May it be to me as you have said. I will pay the price. Joseph, her fiance, was trying to rescue his own reputation, and he was trying to figure out a way to divorce her without crushing her. God shows up in a dream and says, don't be afraid to take her as your wife. And he goes out, bam, and he does immediately what he's asked to do. Describing all of this from a heavenly perspective, Paul writes it up like this, and I want you to listen carefully to what he says. This is so powerful. These verses are packed with stuff that you and I, if we would live them out, would change everything. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, which is basically what Herod did. He did everything out of selfish ambition and vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. Well, that's hard. Not looking to your own interests, which is what you're naturally going to look at, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, Have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. I'm telling you, in the world that we live in, post-COVID world that we live in, we are almost always called every single day, from within, to look out for ourselves. Look out for number one. Don't get sick. Don't worry about other people. Just look out for yourself. That's the drive. You've all felt it. I have too. Did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Another word for this is he didn't grab it. He didn't hold on to it. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. Being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. You get it, right? Satan starts a rebellion in heaven by trying to grasp a crown that wasn't his. And he tried to cling to it, tried to hold on to it, and lost everything in the process. Herod, spent his life trying to grasp the crown, trying to hold on to it. Jesus gave it up. His child in Bethlehem, was born there because of the fact that he didn't consider equality with God something that he had to grasp and leave his fingerprints on. Feeding trough. He ends up in this filthy feeding trough, and it was both his throne and it was also his cradle. And pride, which is these two stories, the story of Herod and the story of the dragon, pride tried to kill him because pride is always out to eliminate the competition. Jesus is competition every story of pride. And I'm telling you, this story shines a spotlight on the one who created everything that exists and yet ends up as a baby lying in a manger. Humility of the Magi is really something else, you see, because they obviously knew Daniel. I'm guessing they'd probably read his book, but they also knew that Daniel looked to somebody who was greater than the big deal king back then, which was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar actually writes a chapter in Daniel's book and basically says, I thought I was really something, and I had this dream that Daniel interpreted for me about this big tree that grew, and this voice came from heaven, cut it down. Daniel told me that I was the tree, but I wouldn't listen. And I was walking around, Babylon thinking, is this not the great Babylon that I've created for myself? And bam, I went down. I began eating grass like an ox. I thought it was hot stuff, and I didn't realize that one little neutron, one little, spark in my brain could set everything off. And all of a sudden, for the next 7 years, I would think I was an animal. And he writes this, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. And then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. Difference between the Magi and the Herod is that Herod had his eye on Caesar Augustus. Caesar was a big deal. Caesar said, I am the Son of God. He prints that right on the coins. He's the Prince of Peace. He made everybody bow down and declare him to be Lord, or they died. That's who he was looking at. And he was looking at somebody who was frail, somebody who would be dead within 10 years. That's the background. Not only did these guys have the record, but they looked at the person, Daniel, and they looked ahead and saw that he had recorded exactly what was going to be happening over the next 500 years. See, it is absolutely insane to think that you have control over everything, because you and I don't. That's arrogance. Arrogance is thinking, I'm going to make the plan, and I'm going to complete the plan because I'm the big stuff. I can make this happen. There's one more part in this story that we're not privy to, but that happened. We know it happened. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to kind of do a little bit of speculating on it. Night before Jesus went to the cross, which was the ultimate act of humiliation, dying in front of people like he did, John gives us a peek into this reality through the prayer that Jesus prayed that night. And Jesus had already made it clear that to be great, we need to serve. He said, if you want to be the greatest, you've got to be the slave of all. And then he got down and he washed his disciples' feet. If you can just imagine the smells and the mess that that went along with that. He did it like a common slave. And minutes later, he prayed this prayer. And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. I want you to just imagine that. The glory of God, the Son of God, before the world began. He was involved in making everything created. And then he somehow inserted himself into Mary's womb, into a few multiplying cells, and was born as a baby. I tell you, this is just unbelievable. And I'm wondering if before this happened, the angels up in heaven who adored him and worshiped him and were created by him were saying, why? Why would you do something like that? Why would you humble yourself and leave your power and leave your crown for these people who think they're such hot stuff? Why would you do that? If that had happened, Jesus' answer would have been, because that's what true greatness does. That's what love does. Love is patient. Love is kind. It doesn't envy, doesn't boast. It's not proud. It's not rude. It's not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. You want to know what the most uncomfortable and disturbing part of the story is? It's not the accounts of the great dragon, trying to consume this baby and its whole family, not trying to kill the son. And it's not Herod's attempt, to kill off Jesus by killing off all the babies in Bethlehem. As horrible as that story is, that's not the most of the story. Because you see, we can kind of put that in the past. Oh, yeah, well, that happened, and blah, blah, blah. It's Jesus confronting our desire to be king of our own lives. See, Jesus comes here and he confronts, the little kingdom that I have. It's a little place of control where I decide how I'm going to spend my money, and I decide how I'm going to spend my time, and I decide whether I'm going to help somebody or whether I'm just going to basically focus on myself. And I'm telling you, just bluntly, Jesus, by coming here, he confronts this little kingdomette that I own. He says, you going to run that? You going to be king? You going to try and steal my role? You going to try and grasp and hold on to the little crown that you found? Or will you let me rule? You see, we have to decide whether or not we believe it's safe for Jesus to be in his rightful place, and that is Lord of our lives. Whether it's right to hand him the crown and say, you choose, and I will worship you, and I will follow you, and I will do exactly what you say, even if I have to break out of this little cocoon that I've created for myself. But what happens many times is we put it off. As uncomfortable as it maybe feels for you to hear this and for me to say this, when we refuse his right to rule over our lives, pride wins the day. Pride becomes king. And it stands against everything that he came to do in this world and everything that he came to change. And I'm just trying to be as honest as possible, There's kind of like this lazy coolness on our part, Glad you came, Jesus, but I need some me time, I need to take care of business. I need to, it's kind of recover and stuff like this, And we think about whether or not, I have to think about whether or not I'm going to let you intrude in my life. He is not an intruder. He is king of all. That's who he is. And we need to see him for who he really is. You see, that's the problem. And many times we don't. We can't. And when pride wins, everybody loses. Jesus loses. We lose. Everybody loses. You don't want pride to win the day. But when we humble ourselves, and when we set aside our rights and our need to be right, and our need to say the last word, and our need to, feel comfortable and feel like we're more important than we are, and we just, serve. Like, set aside the little crown that we want to hold on to, and when we serve other people, we have the potential to have a changing influence on the world. And that's where the comfort comes from. The comfort comes from the fact that we can give up our crown, we can give it up. But I'm telling you, something has to happen in us. And I just want to encourage you in this area of your life to just be vicious. And that's kill pride. Nail it to the cross. That's what Paul says. He says, I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And that sounds like far out there and sounds like really churchy language. And what that simply means is I'm going to set aside my pride. And God will be God in my life. I want to challenge you to do that this Christmas. Whenever you see a creche, whenever you see a baby lying in a manger, I want you to understand that is God laying there in that manger because he refused to hold on to the privileges of being God. Let it go. Let God be God. Let's pray. God, I pray that you will please help us to understand how pride destroys us. We don't see it. It's this invisible thing. Other people see it, though. You see it. And I pray that God, that we would take steps in our lives to put it aside and let you be in charge. Let you run our lives. Amen. And so may the King of all, who showed up in that manger, be the one who runs your life, the one to whom you give your worship and all your gifts. Amen.